So one of the interesting things that I think about as somebody who loves to think about society, government, and how we work, I've recently, it's in the past year, when I was given the gift of getting to see how the Georgia legislative body works. The scariness and the goodness about that is I've begun to have even a deeper appreciation for government and for our society in general. And it got me thinking all the more so about who are we and what are we doing? Deep questions, of course, I'm sure we all ask ourselves from time to time. When I think about those questions in the back of my mind, and I read this week's portion, a portion which describes and details what will happen if we follow in God's footsteps, we'll be blessed. This is the end of the holiness code in the book of Leviticus, where we are told if we do something good, God's going to protect us. It's going to be epic and awesome. But if we don't, there will be a whole bunch of curses. And it's not the first time that we find curses in the Bible. We see them also in Deuteronomy. But when I think about where are we and who are we, in light of the structure of how the Bible set up in a way, the relationship of power and the people, they established it as a covenantal relationship. A relationship that was dependent on God doing something if we did something, or we would do something and God would respond. That relationship was fundamentally dependent, when I thought about it even more so, on trust, which we would also say is faith, and commitment. Commitment to God, commitment to each other, and trust in each other, and trust in God. And when I thought about that questions and that fact, I also thought about yet one other time in American history when we were faced with, well, let's just say, challenging moments. So Abraham Lincoln, when contemplating and thinking about the fate of America, and I will remind you that he loved his Bible, so he was very familiar with the rhetoric of the Hebrew Bible, familiar with the rhetoric of the pilgrims who were really enmeshed in the Bible. He wrote this in describing faith. We are a nation formed by a covenant, by dedication to a set of principles, and by an exchange of promises to uphold and advance certain commitments among ourselves and throughout the world. Those principles and commitments are the core of American identity, the soul of the body politic. They make the American nation unique and uniquely valuable among and to the other nations. But the other side of the conception contains a warning, very much like the warnings spoken by the prophets of Israel. If we fail in our promise to each other and lose the principles of the covenant, then we lose everything, for they are we. If we fail in those promises to be, in my mind, kind, which is what the covenant dictates, to treat our neighbor as we want to be treated, to love, in fact, your neighbor as you love yourself, to welcome the stranger and the poor, the widow and the orphan, otherwise known collectively as those individuals who reside in the margins of our society. If we permit a gross negligence of an extreme gap, as Amos spoke about in his prophetic works of the haves and the have-nots in economic inequality versus equality, then we are breaking that covenant. If we look and see what Hosea was talking about by worshiping in other deities, and for Hosea it was other deities, but we would identify those other deities as superficial focus that we can all get by scrolling constantly on social media and by wanting to post ourselves in our own narcissistic way on social media, by focusing on material objects, almost of worshiping those material objects instead of engaging in deep thoughtful, kind works toward one another, then we are failing in that covenant. We can see how the prophets warned each and every one of us to abide by that covenant and reminded the Israelites when they failed to do so, there was a consequence. The consequence for the northern kingdom was the destruction of the northern kingdom. For the southern kingdom was the destruction of the southern kingdom, which finally resulted in the second temple being built and led yet again to yet one more destruction. And unfortunately, living in the diaspora. And so when we think about that, it reminds me too of something that Lord Jonathan Sacks wrote, that in order to stay free, a nation must worship something greater than itself, nothing less than God, together with the belief that all human beings are created in his image. Self-worship on the national scale leads to totalitarianism and the extinction of liberty. It took the loss of more than 100 million lives in the 20th century to remind us of this truth. When we look at suffering and we push ourselves to be focused on ourselves, we're breaking that covenant even more. And in order for us to remain within that covenant, maybe we need that structure to get back our space in our moral high ground. Maybe we need to think in terms of having a covenantal relationship with one another, with government, and even with God. Maybe that's what we need to once again find our moral bearings. Thomas Friedman wrote in his column this week about mangrove specific trees that exist in the Amazon, and how those trees are there, and what they do is they both protect the land, they prevent it from eroding into the ocean. A variety of wildlife and fish live in there because the small fish can hide among the roots and they're protected from prey, and how those groves protect the land itself. And I think that in a way, they can be a metaphor for that covenantal relationship. Without having that covenantal relationship toward each other, who we are is eroding as a society. Who we are is eroding even for ourselves. When we look and see that many people choose not to belong to different groups of belonging. Even bowling leagues are going down in number, not just sacred communities. And it's imperative for us to stop and ask why. It's imperative for us to think about that as a warning bell, and to once again look toward each other, toward connection. And so this week, I will encourage us to think about that covenantal relationship with God and maybe renew it in our own hearts as something that we might want to choose to even take on for our own selves. Shabbat Shalom.